Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out and making time in your busy schedules to hear a little bit about the boll weevil. I'm going to talk about the boll weevil, but as a means of kind of introducing the topic, I want to say that I'm also going to be describing the history of fear and the myths that come out of fear. The stories that people tell themselves when the real story of why there is change in someone's life is much more complicated. Well, I'm going to talk about the ways in which the boll weevil came to represent all kinds of other problems that were going on in the South, and why using the boll weevil, developing a myth about the boll weevil it was a much simpler way to talk about change in the rural South and change in rural Alabama. Much easier than talking about the real things that were going on. But I want to begin in Texas before we get to enterprise. In 1894, a drugstore owner in Corpus Christi named Charles DeRye was worried about the local cotton crop. He wasn't a cotton grower himself, but he was sure in the cotton business. His best customers were the local planters and landowners, and he certainly benefited economically when cotton prices were high and the cotton was tall. But in 1894, local farmers were coming into his shop to complain about their cotton. It seems that a new bug had appeared in their fields and was eating up the crops like nothing they'd ever seen. Now, DeRye knew the local cotton pests. Farmers often came to his drugstore and bought different kinds of insecticides, and he figured that the locals were just mistaking boll worms or some other kind of cotton pest for this apparently new thing. So he asked a farmer to bring him a few bugs. And when they did, he didn't recognize them either. So he took a couple of the dead insects and he sent them straight to the Commissioner of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. It's kind of a remarkable moment, right? Like today we think of the federal government as this big thing that's very far away and separate from us. And here's this drugstore owner in Corpus Christi who has a new bug, puts them in a little vial and ships them off to Washington, as if the Commissioner of Agriculture is going to suddenly get this little vial of weird bugs and say, oh, we need to help these people in Corpus Christi. But that's actually exactly what happened. So in the letter that he sent to Washington, he said this: "Cotton in this section has been very much damaged, and in some cases almost entirely destroyed by a peculiar weevil or bug, which by some means destroys the squares and small bolls." The message touched off a surprising amount of activity within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Leland Howard, the official entomologist for the department, examined but could not identify the samples, and he passed the specimens on to other experts, both inside and outside his department. When several renowned American entomologists failed to identify the bug, the department finally sent a sample to Paris, France, those same little samples that DeRye had sent up from Texas. And in Paris, an entomologist named Auguste Salle identified the insect as Aphonomus grandis, the cotton boll weevil. What scientists soon figured out was that the boll weevil was a huge threat, not just to Texas cotton, but to cotton all over the South. From this moment in the early 1890s, it was clear. A new, voracious insect enemy had appeared at the southern tip of a huge belt of cotton stretching thousands of miles from Texas to the Atlantic Ocean. The boll weevil had picked up its plate at one end of an all-you-can-eat cotton buffet that stretched out across the South. So the boll weevil is a little beetle about the size of an ant. It's brownish gray in color, and its most revealing physical characteristic is its long snout, or proboscis. The curved nose gives us a major hint as to why the little bug can do so much damage to cotton. What entomologists came to understand relatively quickly over the course of the 20th century is that the boll weevil's entire life cycle is centered around cotton. This dependence on the crop is the principal reason for its destructiveness. In the spring of each year, as the weather warms, boll weevils wake from hibernation and begin eating the leaves of cotton plants that are poking through the dirt in early June. After a few days of eating, they search out mates. After mating, females begin looking for cotton squares to house their eggs. And when a female locates an available square, it punctures it with its proboscis, drops a single egg inside, and then seals the hole with a yellow wax that protects the eggs from the outside world. The name boll weevil is actually a misnomer. It doesn't invade a cotton boll. It invades the stage before it becomes a boll, so it's a cotton square. If you don't know anything about cotton, many of you probably do, think about a regular flower bud and when it's still in that bud stage, when it's enclosed. So the boll weevil is putting a little tiny hole in it, dropping an egg, and then sealing up the hole so that as the egg develops, grows, it's safe from wind and rain and DDT and anything else that you put on top on the outside of the plant. So it grows safely inside. This is a picture. This is a scientist from Auburn, actually, has sliced open an infested square in this picture. So it doesn't actually look like this. He's sort of showing us what's going on inside. So the larva has hatched and is beginning to feed on the fibers from the inside of the cotton square. Now, the weevil's facility for destroying a field of cotton comes from this amazing reproduction ability. It's really an astounding rate. A single pair of boll weevils can theoretically account for over 12 million offspring in a single season, in a single summer. Now, when I started this project, I didn't know too much about entomology, and I saw that figure and I thought, there's no way. So I've looked around for more and more conservative figures, and the lowest number that I've come up with from the entomologists that study the boll weevil was 2 million in a single season. And 12 million is about right in the middle of most entomologists' guesses. So these frightening figures of reproduction give us a hint as to why so many people were worried about this pest destroying all of the cotton in the South. And indeed, in the years after the boll weevil was identified in South Texas, it spread to the north and to the east, devouring cotton along the way. Beginning in the 1890s, Texas officials had drawn maps showing the extent of the weevil's spread. And this trend of drawing maps continued all the way in the 1920s. I'll show you some other maps in a second. But we see here around Corpus Christi, and then each of those lines, those bands, shows the new areas that it's invading every year. People looked at these maps, and they were worried. People who weren't just in Texas, but people in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and the Carolinas. In December of 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt addressed Congress on the State of the Union. Among the most important threats to the nation's health and security, Roosevelt cited a Central American insect that has become acclimated in Texas and has done great damage. But it was no longer only a Texas issue, as evidenced by the special attention that the president was giving the insect. It had already become a national issue. Roosevelt cautioned the boll weevil was a serious menace to the cotton crop. The same year, agents from the state of Georgia had become so concerned about the boll weevil, which the boll weevil was still thousands of miles from the border of Georgia. They banned the importation of any cotton seed or any lint cotton from weevil-infested Texas or Louisiana. Officials were concerned that the bugs might stow away in a container of seed and prematurely invade their state's cotton fields. Their caution was well-founded. By 1904, people across the globe knew of the boll weevil and its threat to the world's cotton supply. Articles about the insect had appeared in national periodicals, as well as in innumerable local newspapers, and they were stark in tone. We know of no single subject that contains more of importance to the entire country's interests, economic interests, than the devising of measures to arrest and, if possible, eradicate this scourge. This was a 1904 article in Science. Later that year, David Houston, president of Texas A&M College, wrote that the boll weevil constituted the greatest menace to cotton production that the cotton farmer has had to face, and that attempts to stop the pest were useless. USDA Special Agent Seaman Knapp, who was dispatched from Washington, actually from Louisiana to Texas to try and find a solution to the weevil and to talk to farmers, wrote later that when he got to Texas into the boll weevil territory, he found a wretched people facing starvation and whole towns deserted. Accompanying many of these print reports, as I mentioned, were maps of the pest's advance, showing menacing-looking, waving bands of destroyed territory. Readers outside of Texas, or in this case, a reader looking at a map of Alabama, a reader in Georgia looking at this map of Alabama could easily envision the pest soon engulfing the rest of the Cotton South. The USDA and state agriculture departments originally prepared these maps and these surveys for pamphlets, which were sent to farmers and to other kinds of researchers. But local newspapers and even national newspapers would sort of grab the maps, leave out all of the scientific explanation of how the boll weevil was moving, and reprint the maps. And so it produced a lot of fear throughout the South and throughout the nation as people looked at this and thought, holy cow, the boll weevil has moved into all of these areas and is marching throughout the rest of the cotton belt. And these maps give the impression that the boll weevil was everywhere throughout these regions, right? And that there was no more cotton being grown. Between the 1890s and the early 1920s, the boll weevil slowly and unevenly crawled and flew across the South from Texas to the Atlantic Ocean. And by any measure, it destroyed a lot of cotton along the way. In the 1890s, some Texas counties reported 70% losses. Georgia had the greatest single season setback when it lost 45% of its 1921 crop. But individual counties experienced much higher damage. By the time the pest reached the limit of the cotton belt, it had destroyed an unseemly amount of the region's cotton. A crop, let's remember, that served not only as the principal economic engine of the entire region, but also was a crucial cultural linchpin. Southerners identified themselves with cotton. At the end of the 20th century, researchers estimated that the beetle had destroyed tens of billions of pounds of cotton since its arrival in the United States, the value of which approached $1 trillion. These mind-boggling numbers suggest not only cotton loss, but also radical changes in the fabric of Southern economic and social life, right? If this much cotton has been destroyed, is being destroyed, then Southern life must be changing. The historical record seemingly agrees. In the early 20th century, it was easy to find people of all stripes raving about the bug. A writer named Harris Dixon claimed the weevil marched through Georgia like Sherman to the sea and creating far more havoc. A writer for Harper's concluded in 1925 that the pest cost America her dominance in the world. An entomologist dispatched by the USDA to research the weevil wrote that in parts of the South, planters and speculators committed suicide rather than face the beetle's wrath. These are pretty common approaches, or pretty common appraisals of the pest's effect on the South from the 1890s to the 1930s. Newspapers, entomologists, family storytellers, traveling country and blues singers, tenant farmers, planters, they've presented the boll weevil as a wrecker of plantation agriculture, an unstoppable natural disaster that swept through the South unchecked and brought ruin to its people. Now, what my book argues is that these staggering figures of crop losses and the social and economic upset that they did trigger were only part of the insect's impact on the Cotton South. I argue that it was the idea of the boll weevil, more than the actual physical destruction that it wrought, that most profoundly changed the region. Contrary to the narratives that I've quoted here, to the country songs and blues songs about the boll weevil that you've probably heard or may have heard, contrary to those stories that you've heard from your parents and from your grandparents about the boll weevil and the damage that the boll weevil did, and even the powerful argument made by those staggering statistics of cotton loss, what I argue is that the boll weevil did not forever change the rural South. The pest's greatest consequence was not the many stands of cotton that it devoured, but rather the great explanatory power that people found in the boll weevil. From the moment that laborers discovered that insect in a field near Corpus Christi, there was a dissonance, a kind of disagreement between the physical damage that the boll weevil was actually doing and the significance that people attached to it. The weevil's destruction of Southern cotton is a big part of the story that my book tells, but it also focuses on the collective anxiety produced by the perception that the weevil's crop destruction would bring social and economic ruin to the South. This perception and the fear that it produced was transferred from a remote cotton field near the Mexican border to the halls of the Agriculture Department in Washington, to state capitals, to juke joints, to mansion porches, and to country stores. I argue that the history of the weevils' spread across the region is as much about fear and expectations as it is about reduced cotton yields and their fiscal consequences. The movement of this fear, as much as the movement of the weevil itself, is the topic of my book. From the 1890s to the Great Depression, the boll weevil myth, told and retold in various forms by people from all parts of society, was this. An enormous swarm of insects was marching inexorably across the South, posing the greatest threat to Southern life since the Civil War. Without a radical rethinking of the very basic ways of life in the region, the myth argued, it would bring, indeed, by the time President Roosevelt was talking about it in the State of the Union, it was already bringing economic and social revolution. It was the weevil's threat that forced farmers, merchants, mill owners, politicians, and countless others to rethink their relationship with cotton, with the cornerstone crop of the region's economy, and with the soil in which it was planted. The laborers who worked it, and the natural environment that fostered it. More than a mandate for change, this cotton pest provided for a range of Southerners an easily digestible, quick, powerful excuse for almost all of the problems facing the rural South in the first half of the 20th century. According to the myth, it was not landowning patterns. It was not these antiquated credit systems that gave farmers access to money at the beginning of every year. It wasn't white supremacy or Jim Crow, or declining soil fertility that made the rural South what it was, that created those problems that were across the rural South in the early 20th centuries. No, it wasn't any of those things created by men and women, right? It was an act of God. It was a voracious natural enemy, a natural disaster. So a range of people across race and class lines attempted to use fear of the boll weevil as both a powerful excuse for the South's poor conditions and as an answer to its most vexing problems. In short, a boll weevil myth was born, one that contained an explanation for and a solution to a variety of Southern troubles. So while myths, rumors, and misinformation often arise out of crises, especially environmental crises, this divergence between perception and reality of the boll weevil's impact on the South was, in most cases, not an accident. It wasn't an accidental creation born of a moment of emergency. Think about the ways that the boll weevil is such a different kind of natural disaster from those we're most familiar with, right? The weevil's transverse of the American South was no quick thing. There wasn't the urgency of a river cresting over a levee, of a hurricane spinning toward landfall, or a fire moving wildly toward a community. The insect took decades to get from Texas to Virginia. Most people had time to try to make sense of the impending disaster and to capitalize on the change that it promised to bring. So Southerners and non-Southerners alike used this threat to push their own various reform agendas. Some sharecroppers, people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder of the rural South, were actually encouraged by the boll weevil's disruption of the cotton economy. What they thought is, if enough landowners, if enough farmers started to get really nervous about the boll weevil, they're going to decide they don't want to farm anymore, right? They're going to decide they want to move to town, as many rural Southerners were doing in this period. And so they thought, sharecroppers thought, this is going to be great. Rather than being a sharecropper, these farmers who own the land, they're going to allow me to rent the land. The landowners are going to want less risk. So sharecroppers, particularly in Mississippi, start to kind of embrace the boll weevil and in some senses tell that story about, oh, the boll weevil is really bad. Tell that kind of story again and again because they saw it as a way of helping them out. Agricultural scientists, lots of people at Auburn University, for instance, saw in the insect an opportunity to advance their own research and to garner funding and resources for their institutions. If you look at Southern land-grant institutions like Auburn and Mississippi State, they have huge increases of funding right around the time of the boll weevil moving through, because the boll weevil is such a national threat they can get lots of support for their research. For example, years after trumpeting the weevil's threat to Southern cotton, Theodore Roosevelt hailed the weevil as a blessing in disguise because of the modernization and crop diversification that it was forcing on farmers. Like Roosevelt, people both inside and outside of the cotton regions understood not only the insect's threat, but also the great possibilities that the weevil offered the rural South. To hear these and other observers tell it, not only had the pest leveled fields, it had upset seemingly unassailable institutions of Southern life. No matter the angle of their conclusions, these accounts presented the pest as a transformative force on life in the Southern countryside. So let me now try to show you briefly how the myth operated in one place. Now, in my book, available for purchase later, makes a wonderful Christmas gift for that Boll Weevil lover in your life. Maybe not. So in the book, I devote 2 chapters to southeastern Alabama, and I'm going to try and condense the story here in just a few minutes. But if you're interested, there's 2 whole chapters on this section of Alabama in the book. The section that I'm looking at encompasses the counties that you see here. It's a region that is environmentally diverse. The southern part is the wiregrass with sandy soils that weren't that great for cotton unless you dumped a lot of fertilizer on it, and the Black Belt, which had great soil. This region is also home to the 2 most important agricultural institutions in the state, Tuskegee and Auburn. And I want to concentrate briefly on the story of Coffee County. It was there that the power of the Boll Weevil myth is in some ways the most revealing. So I want to pick up the story in 1910, as the first Boll Weevils had crossed the Mississippi border into Alabama's southwestern corner. Everywhere the weevil had been so far, one of the things that had come along with it was this idea of crop diversification. For a bunch of reasons, the arrival of the boll weevil seemed to be the perfect opportunity to convince southern cotton farmers to stop growing cotton, to grow something else. And this is an idea that we see ever since the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. You have these new South leaders, governors, newspapermen all over the South who are saying the South needs to diversify its economy. Stop depending so much on cotton. And in most of the South, as the boll weevil had moved through, farmers had ignored these calls to diversify their crops, and they kept planting cotton. They had gambled with the weevil. And many had lost everything, just as the myth assures us, but probably most had not. In the Mississippi Delta, for example, and in central Texas, environmental conditions meant that the weevil wasn't so bad. Farmers adapted and produced more cotton with the weevil present than they had before. But in southeastern Alabama, there was little chance that this would happen. Locals thought seriously about diversifying their crop choices, and surprisingly, the idea actually worked. Part of the reason was the presence of Auburn and Tuskegee. Both schools researched alternatives to cotton and dispatched men across the region to talk to farmers about the boll weevil. They held meetings and knocked on farmhouse doors and tried to convince farmers to stop growing cotton. This is a picture of Thomas Campbell, who was employed by Tuskegee, to go out and talk to black farmers in the rural South and try and convince them to stop growing cotton, and try and help them, trying to convince them of the ways that the boll weevil was going to change their lives. Now, agents from Tuskegee had a particularly difficult task, right? Because in this part of Alabama, most black farmers didn't own the land that they farmed, okay? And if you're a sharecropper, white or black, you are told what crop to grow, right? The person who owns the land, or the person who's letting you borrow the money, sometimes both, says you're gonna grow cotton. If you wanna say, I'm gonna grow peanuts, I'm gonna raise some pigs, then you're not gonna get access to the money or access to the land. So even Campbell going out and talking to black farmers, if they didn't own their own land, and obviously some African Americans in this part of Alabama did own their land, but if they didn't, they had really no control over what they grew in the first place. But then there was this one guy, a store owner in Enterprise, Alabama, the seat of Coffee County. He was owed some money by a local farmer, and this merchant didn't think the farmer was going to be able to pay him. It was 1917, and no, it was 1918, and there was little chance because the boll weevil was marching towards Coffee County, it was almost there, and they'd heard the stories, they'd seen the maps, they knew, the merchant knew that this farmer was going to try and grow cotton and lose a bunch to the boll weevil and not be able to pay back his debt. So the merchant made a deal with the farmer. If the farmer planted peanuts rather than cotton, the store clerk guaranteed the farmer a fair price. Said, all right, you owe me money anyway, you're not going to go farther into debt. I can guarantee you a price for these peanuts, whether the crop is great or whether the crop is bad. So to make a long story short, the farmer made a huge crop of peanuts, while other farmers were fighting a losing battle against the boll weevil. So the following year, in 1919, tons of farmers in Coffee County switched from cotton to peanuts because they'd had this example of success. So the extension agents who worked for Auburn and Tuskegee, who worked all these counties, wrote these annual reports. And I sat in the Auburn Library for weeks reading these handwritten reports from these people. And in this year, the extension agents keep talking about how the farmers had made so much more money in peanuts, how they'd bought new buggies, they'd installed telephones, they'd run electricity out to their farms. There were all kinds of real, tangible, material improvements in farmers' lives in those years. They were buying new buggies, new furniture for their houses. So that same, wait, hold on, let me show you. I'll give you some evidence here. It's a chart. Look, between 1909 and 1919, 1919 is that big peanut year. Look at cotton acreage, how much it goes down. Cotton bales production obviously goes down. Peanut acreage goes up, peanut bushels go up. Fertilizer cost is also an interesting thing. Switching over to peanuts took a little bit more fertilizer, so the fertilizer cost went up too. But you see, this is a real change, right? You're convinced? This is where I always ask my students to nod, or thank you, yeah. You're convinced, look, they grew lots more peanuts. So the guy who owned that store had a great idea, a monument to the boll weevil. So he ordered from Italy a stock metal statue in the classical design. And on December 11th, 1919, an estimated 5,000 people from all over the South gathered in a driving rain at Enterprise's central downtown intersection across the street from the guy's dry goods store to witness the unveiling of this monument to the boll weevil. The statue stood in a circular fountain in the dead center of the intersection. Towering 13.5 feet tall, it depicted an alabaster white woman in a wavy dress with her arms stretched above her head. She held a bronze basin, which spouted water higher into the air. And a marker, unveiled on a nearby corner, proclaimed, "In profound appreciation of the boll weevil and what it has done as the herald of prosperity, this monument was erected by the citizens of Enterprise, Coffee County, Alabama." Now you'll note one difference between the statue picture that I showed you here and the one that we're most familiar with, right? What's that difference? Yeah, it doesn't actually have a boll weevil on the boll weevil monument. In the 1930s or early 1940s is when they cast a bronze boll weevil and put it up there to replace the fountain, which was shooting water out into the fountain. So, I like the line on the marker that says, "What the boll weevil has done as the herald of prosperity." All right? It would seem that finally a place had learned from the boll weevil myth, had gotten out of its way, had planted peanuts, and forever turned their back on cotton. That's, of course, not how history works. 1919, the year they put up the statue, is right there in the center. And you can tell for about 5 years afterwards, peanut acreage continues to climb. That's the darker line there, the thicker line is the peanut acreage line. But what happens? Cotton goes right back up. Almost as soon as the statue went up, so too did cotton prices. And these peanut farmers who drove past that statue on their trips into town put their economic fates back in the hands of cotton and the boll weevil. So what happened? It's a complicated chart, but basically what it shows is that as cotton returned, so too did poverty. That poverty in this corner of Alabama grew. It got even worse. So if we look at the value of farm property, it peaks around 1920, which is that great peanut year, 1919, and goes back down. The average value of farm acreage, the percentage of tenancy, right, goes skyrockets into the 1920s toward 1930. Those extension agents who had written those reports and saying all these people had grown peanuts and they got telephones and buggies. One guy, a Covington County agent, I think that's right, said afterwards, I'm reading 1923 report, and he says he's so angry that these farmers that he's worked with to grow peanuts had returned their fields to cotton, that he says that he stood up in a big meeting of farmers, the most important farmers in the county, and he stood there and he said, you will be poor and ignorant, and your children will be too. That's how exasperated he was to say something like that. I think he quit his job or got run out of his job shortly thereafter. So poverty returns to the wiregrass. What does this story tell us? We see that the boll weevil myth, even 25 years after the insect had first arrived in the United States, the people were still scared of it. That they were willing to plant something else. But we also see the limits of what the boll weevil could overcome. We see why I call the boll weevil in the end a lost revolution. There were so many ways that it could have improved the South socially and economically, had it actually been more like the myth, had it brought revolution to the countryside. And in the enterprise story, we see really the power of stories, the power of narratives. The boll weevil statue is lying to us, right? We can go see it today, but the sign still says the same thing. But the boll weevil was not a herald of prosperity. But people keep that idea, and they grab onto that idea because if you invest in the boll weevil as the thing that has changed your life, right, and not your own actions, it's a lot easier of an explanation to swallow. The final point I'd make is that we think of the boll weevil monument as this one symbol of diversification and its success. But what we don't realize is that there were all kinds of statues to cotton all over rural Coffee County, right? The biggest houses, the new cars that the planters drove at the end of every season. Those are their own monuments to the capital created by cotton. So I think I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to take your questions. We're going to pass mics around, so if you have a question, please wait till the mic gets to you so that...
Yes, we have a mic that's coming around the corner, so we didn't adjust it. We have a question, Dr. Bridges.
How does this boll weevil's pattern spread relate to overall national cotton production and to kind of world cotton prices? Have you worked on that?
Yeah, so just a little bit. But as the boll weevil is spreading, lots of people in Arizona and California and West Texas are saying, the boll weevil can't live in this arid environment. Let's grow more cotton out here. So it's concurrent. You see that spread into other parts of the United States, and it's had a really long legacy there in growing cotton in Arizona and California. In terms of worldwide cotton production, it's the period that I work on up until the 1930s is a little earlier than other countries around the world start ramping up their cotton production. Cotton prices vary wildly over this period. Some of it is related to the boll weevil cutting production, right? As supply and demand, right? The price goes up as production is cut down. But a lot of it has to do with global markets. So for instance, those enterprise farmers who return their fields to cotton, they're really chasing high cotton prices that are created by World War I. So there's such a new demand for cotton that prices go back up. Peanuts weren't great in the war effort. Cotton was.
Have they come up with a chemical to eradicate, and how did that fit into the cotton production that you studied?
So they've come up with lots of chemicals over the years. The first insecticides that farmers used in the South were arsenical compounds that they would crop dust from airplanes, and the first use of crop dusting was by the boll weevil. If you've ever flown Delta Airlines, guess where Delta started? In the Mississippi Delta, crop dusting for the boll weevil. So that kind of early arsenical insecticides didn't work all that well. The chemicals got better and better after World War I into World War II. DDT worked really well. It was very hard not to poison lots of people at the same time, spraying any of these things. I've got stories in the book about sharecroppers whose cabins are sprinkled throughout the field, and the crop dusters are dropping all the arsenic on them too. And lots of debates between sharecroppers and landowners about whether this was doing any damage. The end of the story is that the scientific breakthrough that ended up really working on the boll weevil was these pheromone traps. So someone at Mississippi State, actually, an entomologist, not a historian, developed an artificial pheromone. And so if you've seen near cotton fields, those little bright green sort of cylindrical traps that are sitting on poles every few hundred yards along a field, you see these all over Mississippi still. Those aren't to trap all the boll weevils, but just to get a sense of monitoring their population, and then they can bring in crop dusters with very powerful insecticides. Malathion became very popular in the 1970s, and they eradicated the boll weevil by spraying only in the places where they knew the boll weevil was present.
To follow up on Ed's question about the cotton production, so much of this that you had was cast as a national calamity. How important was cotton during this time to the national economy and its balance of payments?
Yeah, so this is why Theodore Roosevelt is talking about it, right? Because he knows that cotton is so important to the entire national economy. And if you just trace the dollars that are going into your average big Alabama planter, that money is not coming from a bank in Montgomery, a bank in Birmingham. That money is coming from a bank in New York or in Chicago. And so it's all tied up to interests in England, Liverpool, and the early mills who were buying the cotton. Most southern cotton ends up there in the earlier period. And so people recognize that this is a national problem. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It was a substantial part of the national export.
It's a substantial part of the national export, absolutely, yeah. Integral to the American economy. And that's why you see when World War I breaks out such an immediate change in cotton prices, because those demands go up and we're going to ship all that cotton overseas.
Question on the second row.
Well, when I was a child growing up in the Mississippi Delta, when we went across the river, we could not take any live plants back and forth. How long did that last? Did it work? Was that to contain boll weevils?
I don't know that it was to contain boll weevils. Those plant quarantine laws exist for lots of different things. Since the boll weevil comes from Louisiana, it's present in most of those Louisiana counties before it's present in Mississippi. But the one, like I mentioned in Georgia, keeping all that seed cotton out of Georgia, that worked. That no boll weevils were prematurely introduced and could live in any of those newer areas.
Question.
How about now? As far as wild rice, peanuts, and cotton?
How about what?
In the wild rice, are they still trying to grow cotton?
Oh, so today, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head. Probably some people here know better than me. I don't think there's any cotton being grown in those counties anymore. And I show peanut acreage going back down. Actually, those wiregrass counties lead the state in peanut production throughout most of the 20th century. So peanuts are still important there. And in my book, I talk about how peanuts are also related to hogs. You can harvest the peanuts and then have the hogs graze in the peanut fields. And then Swift builds a hog processing plant in Coffee County to take care of all this excess pork production. So all of these things are related into a really diversified economy. And many of the legacies of that remain. Cotton doesn't last after World War II. In most of the South, that has kind of marginal lands. It doesn't become economically feasible anymore.
Question.
Being from Coffee County, I want to correct you. Elby, some people call it Elba, is your first county seat. It's a county that has 2 county seats in it. As I sat here listening to you, and we've had a lot on the Civil War, if this boll weevil had invaded us 50 years earlier, would we still have the war?
Yeah, because the boll weevil doesn't change as much as the story says it changed.
But the cotton would have been basically eliminated 10 years before the Civil War.
I don't think so. I mean, the boll weevil is, and as I try to explain, I get into much greater depth in the book, obviously, but the boll weevil destroyed, in some years, up to 40% of the cotton crop, and those were devastating years, but farmers kept growing it and it bounced back, even on these kind of marginal lands that we're talking about. In Mississippi Delta, in western parts of Texas that were good cotton lands, it was even better when the boll weevil arrived. Mississippi planters in the Delta figured out better ways to grow cotton as a result, and cotton in general improved. And so you don't see, so the second part of that question, right, is about African Americans. And it's about whether, if it happened before the war, we're deep into a counterfactual here, right, but why not? If would there have been, like, you know, African American migration or emancipation that happened when all of a sudden you didn't need cotton anymore? I don't think so. I mean, well, the real answer is most Southern planters would have expanded slavery into other parts of the sort of Caribbean and into the Gulf of Mexico region. Slavery would have lived even if the boll weevil had come in 1850. I can be 100% confident in that because, right? This is total hypothesis.
Were there any attempts to develop a boll weevil resistant strain of cotton?
There were successful attempts to grow cotton that grew faster, that matured earlier in the season, because those boll weevil reproduction numbers that I mentioned, you know, those are growing till you get 12 million boll weevils by August, right, by September. And so they realized if they can pick it in July, they can get the field out of there, the boll weevil population is so much lower. So faster maturing varieties were more important than anything that was ever resistant. They're still not resistant to boll weevils.
Question here.
I gather you're an historian rather than an entomologist.
Yeah.
But thought it occurred to me, is it conceivable that the boll weevil, which was apparently not much of a pest in much of the 19th century, I didn't realize it was so recently, came into the 19th.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that it arose because of the predominance of cotton, more of a monoculture, similar to the pine borer beetles that pest in southern pine?
Yep.
Perhaps there's too much of one kind of crop grown that encourages pests? Is that possible?
So one of the interesting things that I discovered in my book, it was interesting to me, I'm not sure it's interesting to anyone else, but was that the boll weevil can only really live in two environments. There's only two crops in the world, two plants in the world that it can live on, and one is this flowering plant that's a distant cousin to cotton, which only exists around Corpus Christi. So in Mexico, we know that. It wasn't kind of big time industrialized agriculture, cotton production in Mexico in the 1800s. But cotton spread to Texas in the 1880s and into the 1890s in a huge movement. And these are people who'd worn out farms in Georgia and the Carolinas and in some cases Alabama, and were moving their operations to Texas. So as cotton moves to Texas, the boll weevils were probably already there. Nobody noticed them, nobody cared about them, and then it's very soon after Texas arrives that the boll weevil pops up. There's all kinds of interesting stories that I talk about in the book about locals in Texas and what they blame the boll weevil's appearance on. They blame it on dirty Mexican laborers, trains coming from Mexico. They really want to say this is all Mexicans' fault, when the boll weevil had probably been there already, and they were the ones who started growing cotton so close to this other region.
Well, that might be the beginning of the answer to my question, which is, what is the entomological genesis of this weevil? Was it ever found anywhere else other than in Texas? Can we not blame it on Texas?
No, we can't. We have to blame it on Central America, which is the earliest samples, the earliest collection. And that guy in Paris, Auguste Salle, the entomologist, the only guy who knew what the boll weevil was, he had spent some time in Central America and in southern Mexico much earlier, and had found the pest there. And so it was in some entomological literature early on. And it just slowly spread, and I think was probably in South Texas a long time, living on this other plant before cotton spread there. And then we can blame it on Texas. It's fine. Fine with that. Any other questions?
Like I said, I've already answered my question, but one more. When the cotton production goes up again in Coffee County, that's not entirely accounted for by price increase in cotton, because the late 1920s, cotton prices are not good, right? I mean, there is a more complex set of factors than just the cotton price is going back up, right?
Yeah, there are. I go into all those factors in my book, which is available for purchase. And makes a wonderful Christmas gift. But yeah, there's a bunch of factors, international factors, local factors, and really this cultural factor. You know, I'm writing a book now that is about cotton's cultural hold on the South, why Southerners identify themselves so closely with this plant even after it drops away, so even into the late 20th century, even today, right? We celebrate cotton as this very Southern thing, even though so few of us are involved in cotton. And I think that despite the statue, it's why the statue is such a cool sort of historical moment. They have the statue of the Boll Weevil that doesn't convince anyone after they walk away from its dedication ceremony. They go back to cotton, and I think part of it is because they were cotton farmers. There's a great line in Mississippi in the Delta that this writer, David Cohn, wrote, and he said, if you could convince Mississippians to grow asparagus and that they would make 5 times as much money as growing cotton, they wouldn't because they're not asparagus farmers. And it's sort of as simple as that. People identified with being cotton farmers, and that meant something.
Any more questions? We have
Not a question, I just want to share something.
He's going to correct me on something else.
I haven't done a formal cotton pick, not because I wanted to, because I would have to get my butt whipped. I was over we have a big farm thing over in Georgia, and I was over at the doctor here, I was over there last fall, whatever. And now we have mechanical cotton pickers that can pick 50 acres a day.
Yeah.
Price on that little baby? About $800,000.
Yeah, and I talked to an extension agent just a couple weeks ago in Mississippi in the Delta, and it's still economical for individual planters in Mississippi to buy one of those. It seems to me like, why does everybody need one? If I've got 10,000 acres and you've got 10,000 acres, can't we just share it? No, they all want their own $800,000 John Deere cotton picker. Yeah.
They were through with sharing.
Dr. Giesen will be here for a few minutes after the program if you have more questions for him or if you would like for him to autograph the book. And thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming.